"Clean her and bring her to the palace," the Alpha King ordered after she defeated half of his men. The road to the northern border had not seen real trouble in 3 years, so when King Khal Draven's men rode out that morning, most of them expected nothing more than a long, boring patrol. They expected dust, cold wind, maybe a few frightened villagers who would bow too low and offer them bread they could not spare. What they did not expect was silence where there should have been noise, and 18 trained soldiers lying in the dirt with their weapons taken and their pride broken, all because of one woman standing in the middle of a clearing, wiping blood from a borrowed sword like she was cleaning a kitchen knife after supper. Khal did not learn about it right away. He was 2 hours behind his scouting party, riding with his personal guard toward the border settlement his spies had flagged as a possible hiding place for deserters. He was in a foul mood already, the kind that came from too many meetings and not enough sleep, and when his lead rider came galloping back with wide eyes and a shaking voice, Khal's first thought was that the rebels had finally grown bold enough to fight back. "They're not dead," the rider said, before Khal could even ask. "Sire, they're not dead. She didn't kill them." That single sentence bothered Khal more than any report of death would have. In his experience, when 18 armed men lost a fight, someone usually ended up buried. When the enemy chose to leave every single one of them breathing, it meant one of two things. Either they were sending a message, or they simply hadn't needed to kill anyone to win. He rode ahead of his guard, which his advisors would later scold him for, and found the clearing exactly as it had been described. Men groaning in the grass, nursing bruised ribs and dented pride, their swords scattered like the woman had thrown them aside as an afterthought. And there she was, standing near the center of it all, not running, not hiding, not even looking particularly tired. She was not what he expected. He had pictured, in the 2 hours it took to reach the clearing, some hardened rebel fighter, scarred and snarling, someone who looked like violence had shaped every inch of her. Instead, he found a woman of maybe 25 years, lean rather than bulky, with short dark hair pushed back from a face that showed no fear at all. She held the sword loosely, like it was an extension of her arm, rather than a weapon she needed to grip tightly. When she saw him ride in, flanked by more soldiers than the first group, she didn't raise the blade higher. She lowered it. That, too, unsettled him. "Who are you?" Khal asked, staying on his horse, keeping the height advantage out of habit more than need. She looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not defiant exactly, not afraid, something more like exhausted patience, the look of someone who had answered this question, or one like it, many times before, and had grown tired of the answer mattering to anyone. "Someone who didn't want to fight," she said. "They started it." One of the soldiers on the ground, a young man holding his side, tried to protest, but Khal raised a hand and the man fell silent. Khal slid off his horse, his guard tensed, hands moving toward their own weapons, but he waved them back too. He walked closer to her, close enough to see that her knuckles were split, close enough to see the calm in her eyes did not come from arrogance. It came from something else, something that looked, if he was being honest with himself, a little like grief, worn so long it had turned into armor. 18 men, Khal said, trained soldiers, and you did this with a sword you don't even own. It's a decent sword, she said. Poor balance, though. Whoever forged it should be ashamed. A few of his guards actually laughed before they caught themselves. Khal did not laugh, but something in his chest loosened slightly, the tight coil of tension he'd been carrying since the scout came back with wide eyes. He studied her for a long moment, the way he studied maps before a difficult decision, looking for the detail that would explain everything. "You could have run," he said. "The moment you saw them coming, you could have vanished into these trees, and none of us would have found you." "I know. Why didn't you?" She glanced past him, toward the men lying in the grass, then back to him, and for the first time something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, but calculation, the look of someone deciding how much truth was safe to give. "Running doesn't fix anything," she said. "It just delays the conversation." Khal had ruled for 11 years, since he was young enough that most of his court had expected him to fail, and in that time he had learned to recognize a particular kind of person, the kind who had already decided how the story would end and was simply waiting to see if reality would catch up. He had met liars and cowards and men so desperate for power they would say anything to get it, but he had rarely met someone who spoke to him, a king, surrounded by armed men, as though the conversation itself was the only thing that mattered, not the danger in it. He turned to his men and gave the order that would follow him, and her, for the rest of both their lives. Clean her and bring her to the palace. It was not a sentence anyone expected. His personal guard exchanged looks. The wounded soldiers on the ground stared. Even she seemed surprised, her eyebrows lifting slightly before her expression smoothed back into that careful neutrality. "Am I your prisoner?" she asked. "You're my problem," Kale said, "until I decide what kind." Before they left the clearing, Kale made his men check every fallen soldier twice, unwilling to trust the first quick assessment, given how strange the whole encounter had been. Each report came back the same: bruises, a few cracked ribs, one dislocated shoulder that had already been popped back into place, and popped back, Kale realized with a slow, uneasy understanding, by the same woman who had caused the injury in the first place. She had beaten 18 men and then walked among them afterward, fixing what could be fixed, as though the fight itself had been a chore she needed to finish properly rather than a battle she wanted to win. "You set his shoulder," Kale said, nodding toward the young soldier still wincing as he climbed onto his horse. "He'd have made it worse trying to ride like that," Ren said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. No sense leaving a job half done. It was such a small thing, and yet it told Kale more about her than the fight itself had. Cruelty didn't stop to fix what it broke. Whatever this woman was, whatever had brought her to that clearing and left 18 of his best soldiers groaning in the grass, cruelty wasn't the shape of it. She didn't fight the escort. That detail, more than anything else, stuck with Kale the entire ride back. A woman who had just leveled 18 soldiers without breaking a sweat walked calmly between two guards, hands loosely bound in front of her, more as formality than restraint, watching the trees pass by with the quiet attention of someone counting exits she had no plans to use, at least not yet. The palace was 2 days' ride from the northern clearing, and Kale used every hour of it to turn the encounter over in his mind. He was a careful man, not given to impulsive decisions, and yet he had made one of the strangest calls of his reign in under a minute, standing in a field of groaning soldiers with a woman who wouldn't even give her name. His general, a broad, graying man named Roran, who had served 3 kings before Kale and had opinions about all of them, rode beside him for most of the second day, clearly working up to something. "You know what they're saying," Roran finally said. "I can imagine. They're saying you've lost your mind, bringing an unknown fighter, a stranger who beat down a full squad, straight into the palace. Not into the dungeons, into the palace. If I wanted her dead, I'd have let the men finish what they started," Kale said. "She didn't kill anyone, Roran. 18 trained men, and not one of them is going to lose more than a week to bruises. That's not the work of someone who wanted a massacre. That's the work of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and chose restraint." "Restraint," Roran repeated, like the word tasted strange in his mouth. "Or mockery. Some fighters like to humiliate rather than kill. It's its own kind of cruelty." Kale considered that. It was possible. He had seen men do exactly that in his own army, the type who enjoyed watching an opponent live with the shame of losing more than they enjoyed the kill itself. But something about her didn't fit that shape either. There had been no smugness in her when he found her. No triumph. If anything, she had looked like someone who wished the whole thing hadn't happened at all. "I want to know who taught her to fight like that," Kale said. "That's not village training. That's not rebel training either. Not the kind we've seen from the deserters in the north. That was something else. Something formal." Roran didn't answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped, careful in a way that made Kale turn and look at him directly. "There's only a few places in this kingdom that teach fighters to disarm rather than kill," Roran said, "and most of them don't exist anymore." "Meaning?" "Meaning your father closed the last of the royal training halls almost 15 years ago." the ones that trained the old guard, the ones that taught restraint as a discipline, not just a tactic. Cale went quiet at that. He remembered, vaguely, stories from his childhood about the training halls, though he had been too young when they closed to understand why. His father had never spoken of it directly, only in the clipped, closed-off way he spoke of anything he considered a mistake he didn't wish to repeat. He didn't say anything more to Roran for the rest of the ride, but the thought stayed with him, turning over and over, refusing to settle. They reached the palace on the evening of the second day, the towers catching the last orange light of the sun, banners hanging still in the windless air. The woman was taken not to the dungeons, as half the court expected, but to a modest chamber in the servants' wing, where 2 attendants were given the task of preparing her for an audience the next morning. Word of the king's strange order had already spread through the palace faster than any horse could have carried it, and by the time she was led to the bathing chamber, every servant in the wing had found some excuse to walk past the door, just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had beaten half the king's men and lived to bathe in his palace for it. The attendants who prepared her were an older woman named Ilsa, who had worked in the palace longer than most nobles had been alive, and a younger girl named Dessa, who was too curious for her own good and kept sneaking glances at the woman's arms and shoulders, trying to guess where such strength could have come from. It was Ilsa who noticed the scars first. She had bathed enough soldiers and enough servants in her decades of service to recognize the difference between the marks left by an ordinary hard life and the marks left by something else entirely. There were old sword scars, yes, the kind any fighter carried, but beneath them, faint and pale with age, there were other marks, straight lines, evenly spaced, the kind that didn't come from an accident or a battle, the kind that came from a brand, or a lash, applied with deliberate, careful cruelty by someone who wanted the marks to heal into something specific. Ilsa had seen marks like that only once before, decades ago, on the arm of a woman she had served as a very young girl, back when the old training halls still stood. Marks given to those who trained the royal guard directly, marks of discipline and marks of ownership, both at once. She said nothing to the woman in the bath. She simply finished her work, dressed her in clean clothes fit for an audience with the king, and then, once Dessa had gone ahead to prepare the hallway, Ilsa found the nearest palace messenger and sent word to the king's chambers, quiet and urgent, asking for a private audience before the morning's official one. Cale received the message with a frown, but something in Ilsa's reputation, decades of loyal, careful service, never once wasted on gossip or exaggeration, told him this was worth his time. He met her in a small side room off the main hall, candles barely lit, the whole palace hushed around them in that late hour when even servants had mostly gone to sleep. "Sire," Ilsa said, and her voice was steadier than her hands, which were folded tightly in front of her. "I bathed the woman you brought in. I saw marks on her I have not seen in a very long time." "What kind of marks?" "The kind given to those trained in the old royal halls," Ilsa said. "The ones your father closed. I served there myself, as a girl, before I came to work in the palace proper. I know those marks because I watched them being given. Not to punish disobedience, to mark discipline. Only the most trusted trainers received them. Only the ones who trained the king's own guard." Cale sat with that for a long moment, the candlelight flickering across a face that had gone very still. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be after 15 years, sire, but I would stake my position on it." He thanked her, dismissed her with more gentleness than he usually managed at that hour, and sat alone in the small room, long after she had gone, turning the pieces over in his mind. A woman trained in the old royal halls, halls that had closed before he was old enough to understand why. A woman who fought 18 trained soldiers and chose, deliberately, not to kill a single one of them. A woman who walked into his custody without a fight, because, in her own words, running only delayed the conversation. He didn't sleep well that night, and when morning came, he found himself walking to the throne room earlier than the audience was scheduled, restless in a way he hadn't felt in years. She was already there when he arrived, standing near the tall windows with the calm patience of someone used to waiting for things far worse than an audience with a king. She had been dressed in simple, clean clothes, nothing fine enough to be mistaken for nobility, but nothing rough enough to be mistaken for a prisoner either. Her hair had been washed and combed back from her face, and without the dirt and dried blood of the clearing, Cale could see her more clearly than he had the day before. There was a tiredness around her eyes that clothing and cleanliness couldn't hide, the kind of tired that came from years, not days. "You slept?" he asked, which was not the question he had planned to open with. "Some," she said. "Good." He took his seat, the guards along the walls straightening as they always did when he settled into the throne, and the small crowd of advisors who had gathered for the morning's business shifted their attention entirely toward the stranger standing in the center of the room. Roran stood near the throne's right side, arms crossed, watching her the way a soldier watches an unfamiliar weapon, uncertain whether it was safe to touch. "I have questions," Cale said. "You're going to answer them. I figured. Your name?" "Ren," she said. It came out simply, without hesitation, and yet Cale had the distinct feeling it was not the whole truth, or at least not all of it. A name given freely was rarely a name given completely. Just Ren. It's enough for now. He let that go, filing it away rather than pushing, because he suspected pushing would earn him nothing but silence, and he had learned over 11 years of ruling that silence given by choice was far harder to break than silence given by fear. "You fought 18 trained soldiers and left every one of them alive," he said. "That's not luck. That's not desperation. That's skill. Most fighters in my army don't have, and my army trains harder than almost any force in the kingdom. Where did you learn to fight like that?" For the first time since he'd met her, she hesitated. It was small, barely noticeable, a shift in the way she held her shoulders, a flicker before she answered. But Cale had spent 11 years reading rooms full of people who wanted things from him, and he caught it. "I trained your father's guard," she said. The room went very quiet. Somewhere behind him, Cale heard one of the advisors draw in a sharp breath, but he kept his eyes on her, watching her face for any sign that the words were a bluff, an attempt to earn leverage with a claim too big to easily disprove. He found none. Her expression had gone carefully blank, the look of someone who had said more than she meant to, and was now waiting to see how badly it would cost her. "That's not possible," Roran said from beside the throne, his voice tight. "The training halls closed 15 years ago. You'd have been a child." "I was 12 when I started," Ren said, still looking only at Cale, as though the rest of the room didn't exist. "Youngest apprentice they ever took. I trained under Master Corvin until I was 17. By then I was better than half the guards I was helping teach." Cale felt something settle into place in his chest. A piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was assembling until it clicked. His father's guard. The old training halls. The scars Ilsa had described. It all fit together into a shape he didn't entirely like, because it meant this woman standing calmly in his throne room had a history tangled up with his family long before he ever rode out to that clearing. "Why did the halls close?" he asked, though some part of him suspected he already knew the shape of the answer, if not the details. Ren's jaw tightened, just slightly, the first real crack in her composure since she'd walked into the room. "You'd have to ask your father that," she said. "Or you would, if he were still alive to answer." "He's not," Cale said. "So I'm asking you." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that silence Cale became aware, for the first time, of how much weight the whole room was carrying. Advisors frozen mid-breath, Roran's hand resting near his sword out of old habit rather than real intention, the morning light slanting through the tall windows and catching the dust in the air, turning it gold. "There was an order," Ren finally said. "Near the end, one I refused." "What order?" "I'm not going to tell you that in front of your whole court," she said, and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of tired firmness, the sound of someone who had decided, long ago, where her limits sat, and had no intention of moving them for convenience. "Not because I don't trust you, because some things aren't meant for an audience." Cale studied her for a long moment. He could have pushed. He was the king. He could have ordered her to speak. could have made it clear that refusal in his throne room carried consequences she would not enjoy. But something about the way she held herself, steady, despite the exhaustion clearly written into every line of her, told him that threats would earn him nothing but a locked door where an open one currently stood. And more than that, he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he believed her. Not blindly, not completely, but enough to give her the room to hold something back. "Clear the room," he said. The advisors exchanged glances, clearly unhappy, but none of them argued with a direct order from the king. Roran lingered a moment longer than the rest, his eyes moving between Chaol and Ren with an expression that was part warning, part genuine worry, before he too stepped out and pulled the heavy doors shut behind him, leaving the throne room empty except for the two of them and the gold morning light. "Now," Chaol said, "tell me." Ren walked closer to the throne, slower than before, and for the first time Chaol noticed the way she moved, not with the careless ease of someone unbothered by her surroundings, but with the deliberate control of someone who had trained herself, over years, not to flinch, not to show weakness, not to let anyone see the cost of carrying whatever she was carrying. "Your father built the training halls to create the finest royal guard in the kingdom's history," she said. "And for a long time, that's exactly what they were. Discipline, skill, loyalty earned through respect, not fear. Master Corvin ran it the way it was meant to be run, fighters who protected people, not fighters who hurt them for the sake of power. And then your father decided the guard needed something else. Not just skill, obedience without question. He wanted fighters who wouldn't hesitate, no matter what the order was. No matter who the target was." Her voice had gone very steady, very careful, the voice of someone reciting something she had turned over in her mind 1,000 times before ever saying it out loud. "There was a family in the western provinces, nobles who had grown too outspoken about the crown's tax policies. Your father wanted them removed, quietly, all of them, including 2 children who hadn't done anything except be born into the wrong family." Chaol's stomach turned, cold and slow, but he kept his face still, because he needed to hear the rest, and he suspected she would stop the moment she saw him break. "He gave the order to Corvin's best students," Ren continued. "I was one of them, 17 years old, best in my year, and I was told to go with the others and make sure it was done. I refused. What happened? I was branded a traitor to the crown that same week," Ren said. "Master Corvin argued for me, said I was the finest fighter he had trained, said the punishment was too severe for a 17-year-old with a conscience. Your father closed the halls entirely, rather than let Corvin's argument stand. Said if his best students couldn't be trusted to follow orders, the whole system was broken. He was right about that at least. Just not in the way he meant. And you? I was marked, cast out, and told that if I ever came near the palace again, they'd finish what they started with the family in the west. So I left, went as far north as I could get, spent the last 15 years trying not to be found." Chaol sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into his chest like something physical. He had known, in the vague way children know things about parents they were too young to question, that his father had been a hard man, a king who ruled through fear more often than respect. He had heard whispered stories over the years, fragments never fully explained, servants who went quiet whenever certain topics came up, but he had never had the full shape of it laid out in front of him so plainly, and hearing it now, from someone who had lived it, who carried the marks of it on her own skin, made it impossible to keep at the comfortable distance of old rumor. "The family in the West," he said. "What happened to them?" "They were removed," Ren said quietly. "Not by me, by the students who didn't refuse." The silence that followed was heavy enough that Chaol could hear his own pulse in his ears. He thought of the 2 children she had mentioned, thought of his own childhood, safe and sheltered in this same palace, while somewhere else, children his own age had been erased because their family asked too many questions. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "After? Why disappear instead of exposing it? Who would have believed a 17-year-old traitor with a brand on her arm over the word of the king?" Ren said. "I wasn't protecting your father's secret. I was protecting my own life. There's a difference, even if the result looks the same from the outside. Kale nodded slowly, because it made a brutal kind of sense. The kind of sense that came from a world he governed but did not always fully see the underside of. "Why didn't you run yesterday?" he asked, returning to the question that had bothered him since the clearing. "You could have vanished. You're clearly capable of it. Instead, you let my men catch up, fought them without killing them, and let yourself be brought straight into the one place you were told never to return to." Ren was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had lost some of its careful steadiness, replaced by something rawer, something that sounded almost like relief at finally being asked. 15 years is a long time to run," she said. "I got tired of it, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of never staying anywhere long enough to make it feel like home, tired of carrying a secret that ate at me every single day while the people responsible for it kept living their lives like nothing happened. When your men found me, some part of me decided I was done running. If I was going to die for what I knew, I'd rather die having finally said it out loud than die still hiding." "You're not going to die," Kale said, more firmly than he intended. "You don't know that yet." "I do," he said, "because I believe you. And because whatever my father did, I'm not him." Something shifted in her expression then, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something in between, the cautious loosening of a person who had spent so long expecting the worst that hearing something better felt almost dangerous to trust. "That's a big promise for a king who's known me for 2 days," she said. "It's not a promise," Kale said. "It's a decision. There's a difference too, even if the result looks the same from the outside." For the first time since he'd met her, she actually smiled, small and brief, but real. Kale found himself unexpectedly glad to have caused it. Over the following days, the story could not stay contained within the walls of the throne room, no matter how carefully Kale tried to manage it. Servants talked, advisors talked, and soon the whole palace, and then the whole capital, buzzed with pieces of the tale, some accurate, most exaggerated, all of them circling the same central fact. The king had learned something about his father's rule that could not simply be buried, and the woman who had told him was still walking the halls of the palace, unshackled, unpunished, treated less like a captive and more like a guest, whose opinion the king seemed increasingly interested in hearing. Roran predictably had concerns. "You cannot simply forgive 15 years of hiding a truth this large," he said, standing in Kale's private study one evening, arms crossed in the way he always crossed them when he disagreed with a decision, but respected the person making it too much to shout about it. "The nobles will ask why the crown never investigated. The Western families will ask why it took 15 years for the truth to surface. This isn't a simple matter of one woman's testimony, sire. This could shake the whole kingdom's trust in the throne." "I know," Kale said. He was standing at the window, looking out over the training yards below, where he could just make out Ren's figure among a small group of young recruits, showing one of them how to properly balance a blade. Ilsa had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Ren had started spending her mornings there, unable to sit idle, unwilling to simply exist as a guest in a palace full of unanswered questions. "I know it's going to shake things, but hiding it again isn't a real option, Roran. Not anymore. Not now that I know. So what's your plan?" "An investigation. A real one, not a quiet one buried in old files. The families in the West deserve to know what happened to their relatives, even 15 years too late. And Ren deserves to have her name cleared publicly, not just privately by my word alone." Roran studied him for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly, the way it sometimes did when he remembered that the boy he had once doubted had grown into someone capable of surprising him. "Your father would never have done this," Roran said. "I know," Kale said again. "That's rather the point." Not everyone in the palace welcomed the direction Kale had chosen. Within the first month of the investigation, a senior council member named Lord Brant began quietly gathering allies among the nobles who preferred the old king's memory left untouched. Brant had built his entire standing on loyalty to the previous crown, and a public reckoning with its crimes threatened not just the old king's legacy, but Brant's own comfortable place within it. He came to Kale's study one afternoon, smooth-voiced and carefully respectful, the way men like him always were right up until the moment they weren't. "Sire, I understand the impulse," Brant said, settling into a chair he had not been offered. "Truth, justice, all admirable things for a young king to champion. But consider what you're actually doing. You're taking the word of a woman with a traitor's brand on her arm, a woman who vanished for 15 years rather than speak up when it mattered, and using it to tear down the very foundation your own crown stands on. What do you think happens to the court's faith in the throne when the throne itself declares its own history a lie?" "The court's faith should rest on the truth," Cale said, "not on how comfortable that truth is to hear. A noble sentiment. It won't feed anyone, and it certainly won't keep the Western lords from asking whether your own claim to the crown is as clean as you'd like them to believe." Brant's voice stayed pleasant, but the threat underneath it was plain enough. "Careful, sire. Some doors, once opened, don't close on command. Even a king's." Cale did not raise his voice, though something cold settled behind his eyes. "Is that a warning, Lord Brant? Or a confession that you already know what's behind the door?" Brant's smile flickered, just slightly, before he recovered it. "Merely counsel, sire, offered out of loyalty." "Then let the investigation answer for itself," Cale said. "If there's nothing to find, you have nothing to fear from looking. And if there is something to find, Lord Brant, I'd strongly suggest you consider which side of that door you'd rather be standing on when it opens." Brant left without another word, but the warning had done its work, and Cale found himself doubling his caution over the following weeks, aware that not every threat to the truth would come dressed as plainly as the old king's crimes had. Wren, when he told her about the exchange, only shook her head slowly. "There were men like him 15 years ago, too," she said. "Men who found it easier to protect the crown's comfort than its conscience. Some things don't change just because the crown does." "They will this time," Cale said, "or they'll find themselves standing outside it." Brant, true to the quiet, careful way men like him operated, did not challenge the crown directly again. But rumors began to circulate through the capital in the weeks that followed, whispers that the woman advising the king on palace matters had once been cast out for good reason, that her account of the old king's crimes might be less truth than a bitter woman's revenge dressed up as justice. Cale recognized the shape of it immediately, not a direct attack, which he could answer plainly, but a slow erosion, the kind that worked through doubt rather than confrontation. He brought it to Wren directly, unwilling to let her hear it secondhand from some servant too nervous to repeat it to her face. "They're saying you're lying," he told her, watching her reaction carefully, "that this is revenge, not testimony." She took the news the way she seemed to take most difficult things, with a stillness that Cale had come to recognize as her way of absorbing a blow before deciding how to respond to it. "Let them say it," she finally said. "The investigation will find what it finds. If the truth needs my reputation intact to survive, it was never strong enough to stand on its own." "That's not what I asked. I asked how you feel about it." She looked at him then, something almost surprised in her expression, as if the question itself, how she felt, rather than how she would handle it, was not one she was used to being asked. "Tired," she admitted quietly. "I spent 15 years being called a traitor by people who never asked why. It's strange to have it happen again, even with you standing beside me instead of hunting me down. But I'd rather be tired and honest than rested and hiding. I made that choice a long time ago. I'm not going back on it now." Cale found, listening to her, that his respect for her only deepened, and with it, something else, something he wasn't yet ready to name, but could no longer entirely ignore either. The investigation took weeks, not days, and it was neither clean nor comfortable. Old records had to be pulled from archives that hadn't been touched in over a decade. Former guards, some retired, some long since scattered across the kingdom, had to be found and questioned, many of them reluctant to speak, still carrying the same fear that had kept Wren silent for so long. But slowly, piece by piece, the shape of the old crime came into focus, corroborated not just by Wren's account, but by fragments of testimony from others, who had known, who had stayed silent out of fear, and who finally, cautiously, found the courage to speak once they saw that the crown itself was no longer interested in punishing the truth. Ren was present for much of it, not as a prisoner giving testimony under threat, but as something closer to a partner in uncovering what had been buried. Cale found himself seeking her out more often than the investigation strictly required, drawn by the particular clarity she brought to conversations that otherwise dissolved into political caution and careful non-answers. She had no patience for half-truths, no interest in softening things for the sake of comfort, and Cale discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had missed exactly that kind of honesty without realizing it was missing. "You don't have to sit in on every meeting," he told her one evening, weeks into the investigation, the two of them alone in the study, after the advisors had finally gone home for the night, candles burned low, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "I know," she said, "but I've spent 15 years watching this thing from the outside, wondering if it would ever come to light. Now that it's finally happening, I'd rather see it through than wait somewhere else, wondering." "Fair enough." He poured them both a small measure of wine, more out of habit than any real desire to drink, and handed her a glass. "Have you thought about what happens after? Once the investigation is finished, once your name is cleared publicly?" She considered the question with the same careful weight she gave everything, turning the glass slowly in her hand without drinking from it. "Honestly, no," she admitted. "I stopped letting myself plan past the next few days a long time ago. It felt safer that way, less to lose if things fell apart. And now? Now I don't know. It's strange having a future to think about again." She looked up at him then, something steady and searching in her expression. "What about you? Once this is finished, once the nobles have their answers and the Western families have whatever peace this can give them, what happens to the woman the king brought back from a field full of beaten soldiers?" Cale found the question harder to answer than he expected, not because he didn't have thoughts on it, but because the honest answer felt larger than he was entirely comfortable admitting out loud, even to himself. "I've been thinking about the training halls," he said instead, choosing the safer half of the truth first. "About reopening them. Not the way my father ran them, the way they were meant to be run, under Corvin, before he decided obedience mattered more than conscience. The kingdom needs guards, trained the way you were trained before it all went wrong, skilled enough to protect, disciplined enough to know when protecting means refusing an order rather than following one." "That's a good idea," Ren said slowly. "Corvin's gone, though, passed a few years back, from what I heard through old contacts. You'd need someone who trained under the old way to run it properly, someone who remembers what it was supposed to be, not what it became." "I know," Cale said. "I already have someone in mind." He watched the realization land on her face, watched her expression shift from careful neutrality to something closer to disbelief, and then, slowly, to something that looked almost like hope, cautious and unfamiliar, the kind of hope that had clearly gone unused for far too long. "You're asking me to run the training halls," she said. "I'm asking you to help me build something better than what my father tore down," Cale said. "Somewhere permanent, somewhere you don't have to keep running from, because there's nothing left to run from. Your name will be cleared, your history will be told honestly, and the kingdom will have exactly what it needs, a guard trained by someone who already proved, 15 years ago, that she'd rather lose everything than follow an order she knew was wrong." Ren was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the glass in her hand, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the firelight. "That's not a small thing to offer someone," she said. "No," Cale agreed. "It isn't. Why me? Really, you could find someone with a cleaner history, someone who wouldn't drag the memory of that whole mess back into your court every time they walked through it. Because a clean history isn't what the kingdom needs right now," Cale said. "It needs someone who's already proven what real discipline looks like. Not obedience without question, but conscience with skill behind it. You did that 15 years ago at the cost of everything you had. I'd be a fool to look past that just because the story is uncomfortable." She was silent for a long moment, and then, finally, she nodded, slow and deliberate, the nod of someone accepting something far larger than a simple job offer. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." The investigation concluded 2 months later, its findings made public in a formal address that shook the capital exactly as Roran had predicted it would, though not quite in the way he'd feared. There was anger, certainly. Anger at the old king, anger at a truth buried for 15 years, anger that could not simply be soothed away with an apology. But there was also, cautiously, a kind of relief, the relief of people who had long suspected something dark beneath the surface of the crown's history, finally seeing that darkness acknowledged rather than denied. Lord Brant's name surfaced during the final weeks of the investigation, buried in old correspondence that tied him, however loosely, to the quiet dealings that had let the old king's crimes stay hidden for so long. He was not the architect of what had happened, only one of many who had chosen silence over conscience, when silence was safer, but the discovery was enough to end his standing at court entirely. He left the capital quietly, without the theatrics his careful whispers had once suggested he was capable of, and Chaol found he felt no satisfaction in it, only a tired sense of one more piece finally set right. "You were kinder to him than I would have been," Roran admitted, watching Brant's carriage disappear through the palace gates for the last time. "He wasn't the one who gave the order," Chaol said. "He was just one of the people who let it stand. There's a difference, even if it's a small one. I'd rather the kingdom learn that difference than pretend everyone who stayed silent is equally guilty. Some of them still have time to choose better." The Western families received what answers could still be found after so many years, along with a formal apology and support that, while it could never undo what had been lost, at least proved the current crown was willing to face what the last one had hidden. Ren's name, once whispered only as a warning, a traitor to fear rather than trust, was cleared publicly and completely, her old brand reframed not as a mark of shame, but as evidence of a conscience the old king had tried and failed to break. The training halls reopened within the year, smaller at first, more careful, built not around obedience but around the same principle Ren had risked everything to hold on to: skill in service of protection, never in service of cruelty. Among the first recruits to ask for a place in the reopened training halls was Dessa, the young palace attendant who had once helped bathe and dress Ren before that very first audience with the king. She had spent months watching from the edges of palace life, carrying water and folding linens, but the sight of Ren training recruits in the yard below her window had planted something in her that wouldn't let go, a restlessness she hadn't known how to name until she finally worked up the courage to ask. Ren almost turned her away at first, gently, the way she turned away most palace staff who showed sudden interest in weapons after hearing the story secondhand from a dozen different mouths, each version more exaggerated than the last. But something in the way Dessa asked, not with the breathless excitement of someone chasing a legend, but with quiet, stubborn seriousness, made Ren pause. "Why do you want this?" Ren asked her, the same question Corvin had once asked a 12-year-old version of herself, all those years ago. "Because I watched them carry you in half-beaten and covered in dust, and everyone in the servants' wing was scared of you," Dessa said. "And then I watched you fix a boy's shoulder before you even asked if you were in trouble for breaking it. I don't think I want to fight like you did in that field. I think I want to be able to fix things too, the way you did. Even the things you break by accident." It was not the answer Ren expected, and it was, in its own quiet way, exactly the right one. She took Dessa on as her first true apprentice that same week, training her the same slow, careful way Corvin had once trained her, not toward cruelty, not even toward strength for its own sake, but toward the harder discipline underneath it, the one that mattered more than any sword ever could. She threw herself into the work with the same quiet intensity she seemed to carry into everything, training a new generation of guards the way Corvin had once trained her, teaching them not just how to fight, but when not to, the harder lesson, the one that had cost her everything the first time she'd tried to learn it. Chaol found reasons to visit the training yards more often than his schedule strictly allowed, watching her work, learning slowly that the calm control she carried in every fight was matched by an equally careful, equally deliberate warmth whenever she let herself show it, which happened more and more the longer she stayed somewhere she no longer had to run from. It was nearly a year after that first meeting in the clearing, when Kale finally found the right moment to say the thing he'd been circling for months, standing at the edge of the training yard on a quiet evening while the last of the recruits filed out for supper, the sky overhead turning the same gold as it had been the morning she first told him the truth. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how strange it is that the worst day of my rule so far brought me the one person who's made the rest of it feel worth doing." Ren, wiping down the practice sword she still preferred over anything finer the palace armory could offer, glanced at him with an expression somewhere between amusement and genuine surprise. "That's a strange thing to call the worst day," she said, "considering what you found out about your father." "The truth was the worst part," Kale said. "You weren't. You were the one good thing that came out of it." She set the sword down slowly, studying him with the same careful attention she gave everything, the attention that had first made him suspect, back in that clearing, that she was someone worth paying real attention to in return. "You're not usually this direct," she said. "I've had a year to practice," Kale admitted. "Turns out, it's easier to be honest with someone who's spent her whole life refusing to accept anything less." Something in her expression softened then, the careful walls she still kept up out of old habit lowering just slightly, just enough for him to see the person underneath all that hard-won discipline, tired in the ways that never fully healed, but no longer alone with it, no longer running, standing instead in a training yard she had helped build, under a sky she no longer had to watch for danger. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "the day you rode into that clearing was the best thing that happened to me in 15 years too. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet." "And now?" "Now," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded, for the first time since he'd known her, entirely unguarded. "I think I'm finally ready to stop running long enough to let something good stay." They stood there a while longer as the sky darkened and the training yard emptied around them. Two people who had each spent years carrying weight they weren't sure anyone else could understand, finally finding, in each other, the rare relief of not having to carry it alone anymore. From across the yard, Dessa watched them for a moment, before quietly gathering the practice swords left scattered on the ground, smiling to herself in the particular way of someone who has just watched something good happen and knows better than to interrupt it. She had learned enough from Ren in a year of training to recognize discipline when she saw it, and she had learned something else too, something Ren had never needed to put into words directly, that the hardest kind of strength was not the kind that one fights, but the kind that let a person finally stop fighting long enough to let someone else in. The story that began with a king's strange order over a field of beaten soldiers had become something far larger than either of them expected. Not just the uncovering of an old crime, but the slow, careful building of something neither obedience nor fear could touch. A kingdom's guard trained on conscience instead of cruelty, a truth finally spoken instead of buried, and two people who had both learned, the hard way, that the bravest thing a person can do is stay and be honest, even when running would have been so much easier. And in the years that followed, whenever new recruits asked how the training halls had come to be rebuilt, the older guards would tell them the story the way it deserved to be told, not as legend, not as rumor, but as simple truth, that a king once rode into a clearing expecting a fight, and found instead a woman who had already decided, long before he arrived, exactly what kind of person she wanted to be, and that in bringing her home, he had found not just the truth his kingdom needed, but the one person who understood, better than anyone else alive, exactly what it cost to hold on to that truth in the first place. Dessa herself would go on, many years later, to run the training halls in Ren's place, and she told the story a little differently each time, depending on who was listening and how much patience the day allowed. But she always ended it the same way, the way Ren had taught her to end every lesson worth remembering, not with a lesson spelled out plainly, but with the quiet space afterward, letting whoever was listening sit with it long enough to find their own meaning in it. Some truths, Ren used to say, aren't meant to be explained, they're meant to be lived and passed on, one honest choice at a time.